Welcome to Windows on the World. This is part of our manufacturing history series. Several months ago, I spoke to Stephen and Evan Strong, father and son team in Australia, New South Wales, who've made some remarkable discoveries over the years. And I've done many interviews with Stephen and Evan. Also, we talked about artifacts that have been found in Australia, which, according to the archaeological record, shouldn't be there. These anomalies are all over the world, and anyone who's listened to our recent shows on Britain Shattered Isles and Britain the Great Deception will know what I'm talking about, the manufacturing of history. Today I'm going to talk to Stephen and Evan Strong, mainly Stephen I think, about the Kariong Glyphs in Australia, in Gosford. Now, we talked about these many years ago and we're going to get into that today. It's a fascinating subject and I'm going to introduce Stephen. Hi Stephen.
Yeah. G'day, Mark. Nice to see you again. I'm pleased to talk to you, mate.
Well, that's great. I always enjoy our interviews because we often get into areas which other people would not find out about. And that's what this series we've been doing recently is all about, like the way history is manufactured or basically glossed over. And just before we start, in case people aren't familiar with your work who watch the show, most people should be. We did an interview with Stephen and Evan several months ago now. Do have a look at that because it's got all the background in, and much of their stuff is all over the internet about their conferences, and their website is forgottenorigin.com. So Stephen, come in and tell us a bit more.
About the Kariong Glyphs, yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah, well, not so much just at the moment, just an introduction about yourself and what you've been doing recently as an update would be good, I think.
Well, to what we've been doing recently, as you're probably aware, the world's changed somewhat. We were doing lots of outside conferences, but unfortunately, Mark, those that supposedly know everything have decided we shouldn't be doing that anymore. So we changed into something I'm not familiar with, which is the computer, and we do online conferences now. And we've been doing that for the last year and a half, Evan?
Yeah, about a year and a half.
Yeah.
The series is called Our Alien Ancestry, but we have all sorts of topics and guests.
Yeah, we bring in new guests each. Couple of underlying themes there. One about a ceremony that took place at Uluru on the 21st of December last year, and other things around that. So that's primarily what we've been doing because we've realised now that what we enjoyed most was going out and talking to people and showing them artifacts. Well, we can't do that anymore. So we have to go to plan B, which is to do this through online conferences and through computers. So we are now, unfortunately, from my point of view, locked into the world of electronics and computers. So, yeah, we're here a lot now.
That's a real shame, isn't it? Because I was doing talks about 3 years ago and I wanted to take out a historical talk and a film all over the country, and this nonsense has got in the way. Well, that's the global action plan. We're not going to talk about that today because I think we're all bored of it anyway. And it's falling apart, and there is a choice. As we talked about in our last interview, there is a line in the sand, and some people will go one way and others will choose to think for themselves. But tell us a little bit about the Kariong Glyphs, because this has been a controversial topic for a very long time. When I say controversial, what I mean is the authorities are trying to deny the authenticity of what the Kariong Glyphs are. Can you just tell us where they are, what they are, and who found them to start with?
Just north of Sydney.
Yeah, they are.
Which is one of the biggest, it is the biggest city in Australia. Not about an hour and 10 minutes drive north. It's in Brisbane Waters National Park. Little bit of a trek there. I think it takes about half an hour to get there.
It's at a place that up until about 10 years ago, there would not have been a house within about 4 or 5 k's. And you went back 20 years ago, there would have been a house within 25 k's of it. It's at an area where they're subdividing and putting people in and building up an area there where they can have consumers and have people to stick needles in and all sorts of things. But what's happened very recently is that the Kariong Glyphs for some time now has been denied its importance, but to an extent that really didn't matter. If people didn't care about it, thousands and thousands of people go there constantly each year, and they go there nearly all with good intentions to get a lot out of it, and they do.
If you go there on the weekend, sometimes you can't get a
Can't get a car park spot. No, you can't. You could actually set up a sort of online, a takeaway coffee shop and do a real big trade there. But what has happened is the subdividers have moved in and they're going to put in a great big subdivision extremely close, within inside half a kilometre of where the glyphs are. And that for us is a huge concern, number one, because they deny that it even exists, but they don't even look after the place at the moment, and it has been trashed and vandalised. Now we're going to have hundreds of extra people in that area with no control over where they walk. And there are sites within there, sacred sites, that nobody is allowed to even walk near or touch. And they are now open to be, well, misunderstood, to walked on. And things could be taken off these sites. And once they're taken off, they're destroyed. So things have got worse. It's okay for everyone to ignore it and say it's rubbish. You can put up with that. But when you start putting subdivisions within a couple of 100 metres of the place, then it's starting to get to the stage where they're going to destroy the site.
That's a real shame, Stephen. Just to give people a bit of information here, the Kariong glyphs are alleged to be Egyptian hieroglyphs. Can you just tell us a bit about that? Give us a bit of the history for people who may not know anything about it.
Right. Well, it's one of a dozen sites that are all linked together, and people don't even get that. They're intricately linked together. But the site itself are 3 walls which have about 300 hieroglyphs that have been cut into the wall. And the standard of masonry is outstanding. The circles, you cannot see a straight line with a chisel. If there was a chisel, I doubt there was actually marked in it. And it is quite ornate and delicate, the stuff they've done. Now, those 300 glyphs, they go from right up on the floor, virtually touching the dirt, up 4 meters. And they're spread across 3 walls. And what we tend to find, as we've looked at it in some detail, is the first wall has a cartouche in there which reads Lord Dejeb. And there is in there Proto-Egyptian, which is the earliest form of Egyptian, that talks about 2 sons of Khufu who came here in some sort of diplomatic mission, and one of the sons, Nefertari, was bitten by a snake twice and died there. Yeah. Now, that narrative on the first wall, we've got a copy of Proto-Egyptian that was compiled by Ray Johnson and Dr. Dia Abu Ghazi, who's the director of what, Evan?
The Cairo Library,
yes,
amongst the other things.
Yeah, and she's got so many degrees.
Director of Antiquities, I think you said in your article. Yeah.
Yeah.
And for a long time as well, going back to the late 70s, early 80s, I think. Is that right?
She was there. She had this tenure of director for nearly 20 years. So if people are going to dismiss this woman, it would be unwise, because her skills and her expertise are virtually unequaled in the country. And she, with Ray Johnson, spent quite some time, and we've got handwritten notes where she signed off and said things like, when this book comes out, it will be sold out and thousands will come to this site. Now, we've had academics who said, oh, yes, she was contacted by him, but it was stalking and she had nothing to do with it. Man, we've got pieces of information that go over 15 years where she's signing off with her name, writing to this guy. She backed him fully and she wished him every success and said she would do anything to help. So this was something that was worked on for quite some time. Now, I've got to make the point that the Australian government, or the New South Wales government, did send in an academic, not an expert, an Australian academic from Sydney Uni, who did teach a unit in Egyptology. He's not an expert. He's a 101 compared to Dr. Dia. And he made the commentary when he got there that a lot of the glyphs he didn't understand and didn't recognize. Well, of course, because it's Proto-Egyptian, and that manual was compiled by Ray and Dr. Dia and wasn't completed until 1995, and he went there in 1983. Of course, there'd be stuff there he wouldn't recognize because he wouldn't know about it. He's not at the top level when this is taking place. He's down basically in the feeding trough. And he came back and said, well, I don't recognize some of it, therefore it must be a fake, end of story. So primarily that's been the basis.
There's been other things like the Syrex were reversed. So they said,
oh, yeah, that's
real,
right.
But we've since discovered.
Well, actually, it's funny because the Sydney Uni said the cartouches have the characters in the wrong way around. Well, it's funny because they aren't even cartouches.
That's right.
They're actually Surex. So these experts said, because a cartouche is a square piece, and in the first one, the Proto-Egyptian part, which they wrote, is square. But all the rest are actually called Surex. They're rectangular, and the animals face in the opposite direction. Well, this guy from Sydney Uni said, well then, they got the animals back to front. This guy must be an idiot. Well, the problem was he didn't know until 2005, and Lance Scranton told us about this. They discovered a Proto-Egyptian Surex, and they were reversed because it was supposed to be the wisdom of Thoth. And his writing was always done mirror reverse. So that's why they reversed them, which then gave us a clue that this particular place has stuff in there that is supposed to be of the most secret order, because they've reversed the Surex, and that's quite rare. Now, all this information was outside the boundaries of an Australian academic that does a little bit of reading on Egyptology, but it wasn't outside the boundaries of Dr. Dia. And then further on in the piece, Mark, we decided, and I think I wrote in the article, when you have two academics in dispute, you bring in another academic to work out which is correct, which we did, didn't we, Evan?
Mm-hmm.
We brought in Dr. Muhammad
Ibrahim and Yusuf Owen.
That's right. And what they did was they looked at pictures of the glyphs, right, independently of each other, and made their own decisions about it, then came together in a series of videos.
Yeah, it's to the point where they were able to work out the background and the personality of the scribe.
Yeah.
To that extent.
They spent a long time working on this, and they put out 3 videos, and then Dr. Muhammad made an application to come to Australia to talk with us and explain that the glyphs are legitimate. Now, Dr. Muhammad has a job in a university in Egyptology. He has a family there. He lives there, and he was denied access in Australia because they thought he'd be a terrorist risk. So he wasn't allowed to come to Australia, because then we would have had another academic saying exactly what Dr. Dia said, which is that the glyphs are legitimate and there is Egyptian on those walls. And that, for me, is something we know to be true. And of course, it really doesn't matter what we do to try and convince mainstream. They're locked in on this, because we also know, Mark, that we worked also with the gentleman who was paid by the government to work at that place by National Parks and Wildlife, and was the Aboriginal Sites Officer. And his name is David Fitzgerald. Well, him, along with Arnie Bev Spears, were never asked what it was. And they all said the same thing. It is legitimate. It is ancient. And all of these people have been ignored. Now, David told me one thing that gives me a clue as to why this happened. From the very beginning, he had to fight and barter his way to have a look at this site, because they all spoke about it, but no one would show anyone. It was like a secret that was kept at the highest orders. And he bartered his way in to go and see it, and he was allowed to see it at dusk. And he was told if he told anyone about it, he'd lose his job. So he didn't say a lot about it until he left, and then he's been talking about it all the time, because that was his only job at the time. And what he told us was that the whole thing, all of the walls were full of rubbish, trees, rocks that had fallen in there, and it took 6 men 2 days to clear it out. Now, the popular story about the glyphs is it was created by what they call a deranged Czech in 1975. David was between those walls 3 years later, and he told me there's no way anyone could have walked in between those walls for the last 30 years. There was so much inside it. So it's been a cover-up from the start. And we do know, and David told us about this, that money was set aside to destroy the site before it became well known. And there's a woman that worked for National Parks and Wildlife, and she was supposed to, when she retired last year, wasn't she, Evan? Supposed to spill the beans and tell everyone the whole story, because she was given money to destroy it, and she kept prefabricating and putting it off until the public found out about it, and they couldn't. At one stage, they were going to blow it up.
Yeah,
with artillery practice.
Yeah, going to use it as artillery
and to destroy the whole thing. And you talk about destroying history, they were going to literally do it, Mark. They weren't going to sort of hide it. They were going to blow it up. but they couldn't because people started to stumble on it and went and saw it. So then they started creating these alternative stories about a deranged Czech with reduced IQ was found walking out of there with a chisel. Not found inside the walls doing it. They never said that. Coming out of there with a chisel. Well, a lot of people have been in with chisels to the face, haven't they?
They have.
They still are. But I never said any of them made the whole thing. But what they decided is because somebody walked out with a chisel, not a hammer and not a ladder, even though it's 4 to 5 meters high, but just a chisel and no manual, because there was no manual in Proto-Egyptian until 1997. This was 1975. But that was enough. That was good enough for the government. Oh, by the way, we don't know his name. We haven't got a film of him saying it, and we don't have a stat deck of him declaring to do it. But there's a rumour the chisel lays within somewhere in the Gosford Council, doesn't it? Mm. And academics have asked to see it, and they said, oh, we've lost it. So primarily they've lost the chisel. They can't find the name of the deranged Czech who did it. No one saw him actually doing it. But that's good enough for mainstream. All we've got are 3 academics who claim it's legitimate, and we have an analysis of 2 artifacts that were found there. One is of a bone that is thousands of years old, and the other is of a piece of jewelry that has 24% not identified on this planet. It has content within it that no machine in Australia can recognise on the periodic table. We've got all that. And what they've got in return is a rumour about a deranged Czech and an academic that said, I don't recognise this, I don't understand it, nothing to see here, it's a fake.
They do have another theory too, don't they, that uni students went there?
Oh, yeah, they've got a second one, mate. They've actually got 4. If you put up enough mud, it sticks. And the other one they've got was Sydney uni students did it in 1964. And they spent their time out in the bush and they made the whole thing then. Which is interesting because Sydney Uni have never run a course on Egyptian hieroglyphs, so they're not going to get a mark for it, and they weren't paid for it. But apparently they spent weeks out there creating this, and not one student has ever put their hand up and said, I've done it, but that's another one they've put up as well. Oh, and also hippies did it.
Hippies did it,
yeah.
And then a grieving World War I vet did it as well.
As a dedication to his fallen comrades in a place in 1919 that no one had been and seen and never went there. In fact, the first house that was ever built in that area was 1939.
Yeah, because I think he made a sculpture, an Egyptian sculpture on a beach, on a public beach that everyone could see. But no hieroglyphs on it.
No hieroglyphs. No.
Just a replication.
And there's no record in a diary or a statement where he said, I did it. But that's what they've done. What they've done is they've shopped around and made up all these different stories that are illogical, can't be proven, don't have stat decks, and said, this is what actually happened there.
Talking about stat decks, we do have a stat deck.
Oh, yeah, we do. Yeah.
That was there in the early 50s, wasn't it?
Early 50s. We've got a stat deck. We've got it right now by a lady called Helen Cockburn. And she was taken there by the secretary of what was National Park and Wildlife then, and was told by him that this is Egyptian. This was in 1958. That is before the students could have been there, before the deranged Czech. And he was running National Parks and Wildlife in 1958, before it was changed to another name. He was running the whole of the state. And he took his young niece there when she was 10. And she said, I stood between there and saw all this, the cross of Fenen. I saw all this Egyptian stuff. So we actually do have a stat deck, and she's alive and prepared to go and make that statement in any inquiry they want to hold. But with all that, with all of that science and all that truth, it comes to nothing, because right now the New South Wales government have approved it for this subdivision. The Gosford City Council have approved the subdivision, and the subdivision is being run by the Kariong Aboriginal Lands Council, and they've approved it too. So what's going to happen is they're going to start pulling in houses, bulldozers to rip the whole place apart so people can move into that area and settle there. So that's the brief story about Kariong. It's not all good.
No, but it's fascinating. And I think the most important thing is that the people who are the new priest class, who are going to be looking after this stuff, need to actually preserve it and put it out there, which is in a way what you're doing, what we're trying to do here, and other people are trying to do. I did a show on Sunday about this, that knowledge is being lost and people are becoming more dumbed down and stupid and not interested in history at all. So that's a big problem too. I mean, even if you go back 500 years, people don't know much about anything these days. So this stuff is very important to certain people. And I think that's the way it has to be viewed now. There has to be a sort of interconnected, if you like, group on the planet who are interested in this stuff and keep it going, because the majority of the public, let's face it, aren't interested or haven't got time or can't be bothered. And it's a very specialized area. All of this ancient history stuff is a specialized area, which is why I try and keep it very factual. I try and look at it very calmly, try not to make too much assumptions. Our latest kind of foray into this is all about the works of Comins, Beaumont and beyond, about how history was actually changed and transplanted. And I think you've given an example there.
Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net.